It's this week we discussed the end of the Parsha, the two Parshiyot of Kadesh Li and V'Akev Yecha, two very interesting paragraphs that apparently we can find in our Tefillin that we wear every single day.
And it's fascinating because we see a huge gap between what Hashem tells Moshe to do and what Moshe actually talks about. And we realize how all of this is deeply connected to this very, very special moment when this speech is being given.
Exactly, and we also asked, why do we have these in the Tefillin? What's so unique about these Parshiyot, these paragraphs, to put them in the Tefillin? Why is the Tefillin such an important mitzvah for us? What's so significant about the Tefillin? Hope you enjoy it. Take a look. So this week for Parashat Bo, Am Yisrael finally leaving Mitzrayim after the 10 plagues. Last year we discussed why 10 plagues. We'll link that video at the end of this one. This year I want to talk about the end of the parasha, where we find two of the more known Parshiyot. The Parshiyot called Kadesh Li Kol Bechor and the Parshiya of V'Akev Yecha. Two Parshiyot that are known because you can find them in the Tefillin that we wear every single day. And number one, you have to ask, what's so important about these Parshiyot that we have them in the Tefillin? Obviously, the Tefillin themselves are mentioned in these Parshiyot, but what makes them so special? What else in the context makes these Parshiyot so special that we put them in the Tefillin? But even more so, when we look into the Psukim themselves, there's some very, very confusing things going on, because when you look at the Psukim, we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu telling Moshe, Kadesh Li Kol Bechor, make every firstborn, both from human and from animals, holy to me. And then what does Moshe go and do? Does he tell this to Am Yisrael? No. He goes and tells to Am Yisrael, he commands Am Yisrael about Pesach. Celebrate for 7 days, eat matzahs, don't have any Chumetz. And this is the end of that Parshiya. And then when you continue on, then we have V'Akev Yecha. Moshe continues to command Am Yisrael about this concept of having a firstborn and separating it, making it different from all the rest. And really you have to ask, what's going on over here? Why is Moshe changing from what HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded him to do? Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu tell him to command on Kadesh Li, make every firstborn holy, and Moshe goes and talks about Pesach? And then also he doesn't talk about being holy, he talks about separating. So what exactly are these two Parshiyot about? Why are they so important? How come they're part of our Tefillin? What's going on in the end of this week's parasha?
Yeah, this is definitely very confusing. And when you look at what Moshe does talk about Pesach, you're thinking, Hashem just told you to talk about something else. I mean, Pesach is important, but why are you telling them now? You've spoken to them about Pesach. Well, actually not. If we go back in the Psukim and we look at the famous commandment, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, where Hashem tells Moshe everything he needs to do, everything he needs to tell them about the Korban Pesach, about putting the blood on the doorpost, talking about everything that they're going to do, and Yetziat Mitzrayim, and talks about Pesach and talks about not eating Chumetz and matzah. It's all there. But when we look further on, what Moshe actually tells the leaders of Am Yisrael to tell them, we don't see most of that. The only thing we see is the Korban Pesach. That's all we see. We see the commandment of Korban Pesach and mentioning that Korban Pesach is something that will continue for generations. Nothing about the matzahs, nothing about not eating Chumetz, not about 7 days, nothing about all of Pesach, which in our mind was already told, wasn't told to them. So Moshe now is telling them something he was actually commanded to tell them, but why is he telling them now and not back then when he was told to tell them? So obviously there's something really unique about this timing, and obviously this somehow connects to what Hashem was asking him to do. And if we stop and think about this moment, we'll realize this is a dramatic moment. This shows up like at the end of the Parsha, just like another Parsha. No, this is probably one of the most dramatic moments. Maybe this is why it's in our Tefillin also, right? What is this moment? This is the 1 second after they leave Egypt. Everything until this point is Am Yisrael are slaves. This is that first second of freedom. What happens in that first second of freedom? We all talk about leaving Egypt. We talk about the slavery. We talk about getting out of slavery. But now, for the first time, they're free. What do you do in that first second of freedom? That's what this Parsha is about. And you know what's also very special about this moment? This is the first time Moshe is speaking to all of Am Yisrael. He tried doing that back in Egypt with Hotzeti v'ga'alti v'lakachti, but no one was listening because they were all slaves. And from that point on, he speaks to them, but through their leaders. So what do you say at this dramatic moment? Hashem tells him, Kadesh li kol bechor. You have to sanctify kol bechor. What is sanctify? They don't even know this term yet. By the way, it did show up about Pesach, Mikra Kodesh, but as we know, he didn't tell them about it. He's about to tell them about it. This is already, you see the link here. This is the first time they're going to be taught about Kedusha. And why is that? Why is this that first thing that Hashem tells them to do? And we've discussed this in the past. What does the term Kedusha mean? In Hebrew, the term is not only about sanctifying, it's not only about holy, it's about dedicating something. Even in modern Hebrew, when you dedicate something to someone, it's lahakdish. Lahakdish is when you set something aside as special for a unique purpose. And if you think about it, what is this moment of leaving Egypt? This is the moment where until now it's all about getting away from, escaping from, leaving something. And what do you do with all that freedom? Comes HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that first second and says, don't just stay in that void. It's not just about getting out. Now that you're free, use that and dedicate yourself towards something. Sanctify something. Maybe this is why Moshe didn't talk about Pesach and Mikra Kodesh back in Egypt, only about the Korban, because the concept of Kedusha only exists when you control your life, when you control time. You can't sanctify time if time isn't yours. You're a slave. Sanctifying means I have control over my life. I can do a lot of things with myself, and I decide to dedicate it to something special. That's what's happening at this dramatic moment. Leaving Egypt wasn't just about leaving Egypt. Now that you're free, take that freedom and see how you sanctify yourself towards something. And maybe that explains everything that's happening here. Hashem tells Moshe, Kadesh li kol bechor. And by the way, Am Yisrael, as Hashem said, is bni bechori. All of them at some point have to be sanctified. And Moshe doesn't use the term sanctify. He doesn't use the term kadosh. They don't know what it means really yet. He tells them how to achieve that. And how do you achieve it? As we know, there are three levels. Olam, Shana, Nefesh. Olam represents place, Shana represents time, and Nefesh represents yourself, the individual, your soul. And we see all those three play out here. We have the place, both of these mentioned, V'hayaki Aviecha. When you'll come to that place, which will be yours, you're not there yet, but when you get there and it'll be yours, you're going to sanctify that. And when time now has become yours, you're going to sanctify that time. You're going to sanctify it through matzah, through Chumetz, which represents how you see time and what time means. And you're going to sanctify it by dedicating the firstborn, by dedicating yourself, by dedicating the person. So we have the place, the time, and the person. Moshe here is answering exactly what Hashem wanted. Hashem says, you've left Egypt. I'm not going to wait even one pasuk. The moment you leave Egypt, now's the time to see what you do with that freedom. What you do with that freedom is Kedusha, is dedicating towards something every aspect of your life. And that's why Hashem's commandment of Kadesh is expressed through all of these Psukim that we see further on. And maybe that's why they become so critical to who we are and to everything we do in our life in every single mitzvah, and expressed with the Tefillin, which we tie every day to ourselves, not only leaving the world we were tied to, but tying ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to where we want to be.
Beautiful, very good. And we keep on saying this point, the battle or the balance between Mitzrayim that Am Yisrael left and Am Yisrael, what they're supposed to achieve in this world, because really these few Parshiyot, this struggle, this battle again between Am Yisrael and Mitzrayim is what our life is about. As we've said many, many times, Mitzrayim resemble the materialistic world, the world of slavery, the world that you are enslaved to, that actually controls you instead of controlling it. And Am Yisrael are now finally leaving that world and becoming masters of their own. They are in charge of their own time, their own body, their own place, like you were saying. And at this point, Moshe teaches them about the concept of Kedusha, the concept of holiness, the concept of sanctifying and dedicating yourself towards a higher purpose. It's not only about you, because people cannot live only about themselves, because they will always look for something bigger than them to work for, or bigger than them to be part of, or a system to be part of, because like you said, when there's a void, something will come in at some point and take the place of holiness. So Moshe Rabbeinu right now, right over here, teaches Am Yisrael about this concept of Kedusha. He teaches them now about the 7-day Chag of Pesach, because Pesach is not only about that Korban that you had to bring that we talked about back in Mitzrayim, but also you will have every year a 7-day holiday in which you will celebrate this. And with that connected is also this concept of the firstborn, both in the person and also in the animals, and understanding that this firstborn you will have to dedicate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you have these commandments around these concepts. This is what helps Am Yisrael understand that they have to dedicate their life towards this higher purpose, toward what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is intending for them to do. Once, Bezrat Hashem, they reach Eretz Yisrael, supposedly in the next few weeks. We know it doesn't happen. We know it ends up being 40 years, but they will have their purpose to fulfill in this world, to bring into this world, to teach the world not to be slaves, not to be slaves to this world, to nature, but to go on top of it and to live a life of fulfillment with a greater purpose on top of it. And you know, when we look at everything that goes on over there back in Mitzrayim, in the Parsha B'chodesh Zelechem, in the middle of this week's Parsha, we see many different things that express this point. That first of all, the whole idea of Korban Pesach actually happens on Erev Pesach. The whole idea behind Pesach, of Korban Pesach, actually happened before Pesach began. Pesach begins after Korban Pesach is brought. That's when Pesach begins, because we really have these two concepts of Korban Pesach, which is one thing, and then the 7-day holiday, that comes after it, which is a different thing, again, which Moshe teaches Am Yisrael over here once they left Mitzrayim. These are two separate mitzvahs that come together, but they represent different ideas. And also, when we look at Korban Pesach itself, there's an act that happens back in Mitzrayim that was part of Korban Pesach over there, but didn't make it throughout history into our Korban Pesach today, which was the act of taking from the blood and spreading on the doorposts. We see that that's an intrinsic part of Korban Pesach back in Mitzrayim. In the Psukim themselves, Moshe says, take this Korban, take this seh, then take the blood and put it on the doorposts. It's all one commandment, it's all one act. However, we don't do that today. We only bring the Korban because maybe this is exactly the connection to Tefillin. This is where Tefillin come in, because the whole idea behind the blood on the doorposts in Mitzrayim was Vayaleot, the pasuk says. This is a sign. A sign for what? A sign that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows to skip over Am Yisrael. Vepasachti, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows to go over Am Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will separate Am Yisrael already in Mitzrayim. Because if Am Yisrael want to separate themselves from Mitzrayim while they're still in Mitzrayim, they can't do it. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do it. But they need to have that sign for themselves. They need to put the blood on the doorposts. Once they do it, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will show them what it means to separate themselves when in Mitzrayim. But when do Am Yisrael separate themselves? Once they are really detached, once they're disconnected from Mitzrayim, that's when they can start to understand how to separate themselves, how to elevate themselves, how to dedicate themselves. That happens after they leave, and that's when they have a different ot. Vayale ot. That's the tefillin. The tefillin that later on we see ukshartem leot. This is what we wrap them around for a sign for ourselves to remind us of this separation, to remind us of the separation that happened in Mitzrayim. While we were in Mitzrayim, it happened by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Once HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim, that's when we have to start dedicating ourselves. It's not only about separation anymore, but it's also about dedicating, about sanctifying our lives, about putting holiness into our life. That's what the tefillin represent. This ot that began in Mitzrayim on the doorposts, but later on, once we left Mitzrayim, now that we have our mission in the world to fulfill, now it's about wrapping it around our hand, putting it between our eyes, as the pasuk says, to remind us of Torah Hashem, to remind us of our purpose in this world, which is to bring the holiness into the world. Maybe this is why Moshe Rabbeinu had to separate these two mitzvahs of Korban Pesach happening in Mitzrayim, telling it to Am Yisrael in Mitzrayim, and the concept of the holiday of Pesach, of Chag Pesach, which he teaches Am Yisrael now once they leave. And these two Parshiyot of Chag Shivat Yomim, of having Pesach for 7 days, and the concept of firstborns which are born, both of them teach us this concept of dedicating ourselves, of lekadesh ourselves, of bringing kedusha into our life. This is what the tefillin are about. This is the purpose of the tefillin. And very interestingly also, we have the very famous Gemara, which cannot be taken literally, but as a concept to understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself wears tefillin every single day. The Gemara that discusses HaKadosh Baruch Hu having tefillin, asking, what does this tefillin say? If our tefillin has these Parshiyot teaching us to have holiness in ourselves, what does this tefillin say? Mi ke'amcha Yisrael, goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like Am Yisrael, which is a separated nation, a nation that separated itself from Mitzrayim, a nation that separated itself from this natural world that's ruled by nature and looks at this world through the eyes of holiness, through the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what purpose HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for us for this world. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's tefillin say, and the tefillin themselves, the mitzvah that we wear, which is our pride, which v'ra'u kol amei ha'aretz ve'yaru mimeka, as the Gemara says, this is what sanctifies us in our own eyes, but also in the eyes of the world, because this is our purpose, because this is our mission in this world. And as we were saying, this is the first thing that Am Yisrael is learning now, just as they leave Egypt. There's not even 1 second goes by with Am Yisrael not having this mission on them, because we were taken out of Mitzrayim to fulfill this mission, to be the nation that brings into the world this concept and this idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a purpose for us. We have a higher purpose to live by. This is what true freedom is about. This is what freedom is about. Avdei azman, avdei avadimem, eved Hashem hu levado chofshi. Once a person understands this is what gives them value in their life. This is why this is the first mitzvahs, the first things Moshe tells Am Yisrael right now, what our purpose of life is once we left Mitzrayim.
You know, it's interesting when we compare this to Kedoshim to you, if that's what we're seeing here is a commandment to be holy. It's interesting because Kedoshim to you is we should be holy. And here it's Kadesh li kol bechor. It's talking about your children. You sanctify something else. And this is very interesting because if we look at the Psukim, what we see over and over here is talking about the bechor, but also talking about my children. V'yigadeta lebincha, ki shalcha bincha, right? It's about teaching to the next generation. Those who left Egypt, Hashem took them out of Egypt and he sanctified them by pulling them out and taking them somewhere. But now the commandment is about dedicating dedicating and sanctifying your future, your bechor, sanctifying what's going to be. And that's why it's talking about the future when you get to Eretz Yisrael. And that's why there's so much focus here on your children and on teaching your children. And I think if we look in the Psukim, this also answers something else, because it's clear why Shema is in the Tefillin and V'hayayim Shamoah is in the Tefillin, and why each of them, it says that you should put it in the Tefillin. But here we have basically one story, one commandment. It starts with Hashem telling him what to do. He goes through Pesach. He ends up getting to what Hashem told him at the beginning. Why does it have to say twice that you need to put this in the Tefillin? But when we look carefully at the Psukim, we'll see some interesting differences between the two. One of them that stands out is that in one of them it says you should put on Tefillin, Ki bechozik yad hotziacha, Hashem took you out. And then the other one it says Hashem took us out. Why is that different? We look carefully in the Psukim, and I only noticed this lately. The second time is not Moshe telling us again, you should put this in the Tefillin. It's all part of the speech to your child. He asks you, what is this all about? And you tell him the whole story, and you tell him that we were taken out of Egypt, and you tell him about putting the Tefillin because Hashem took us out of Egypt. And when you notice that, you realize how half of what's being described here is about your children, is about teaching going forward. And I think that's the message, because a slave, all he's thinking about is now, is the present. He has no future. And the first thing you do going out is, what do I do with all my time? What do I do with my life? Suddenly I have a present. I also have a future to think about. And that's what this is talking about. What do you do with your time? What do you do with your present? And even more important, what do you do with your future? How do you dedicate that? How do you put value into that? That's what we have here in this first speech, that Moshe successfully reaches Am Yisrael and is able to speak to them when they're actually listening and free and searching for what do they need to do now with their lives after this great moment.
Exactly. We're out of time, so we'll have to end here. As usual, just remind the viewers what we discussed. I mentioned one year we discussed the 10 plagues. Why are there 10 plagues? Why do we need 10 plagues? Why not skip to the 10th one and just let Am Yisrael out? Why do we have to go through the entire process? We'll link that video. We also discussed the year before that, what did Am Yisrael exactly celebrate in Egypt during that first Seder night, if they weren't even out of Egypt yet? Seder night is all about leaving Egypt and discussing the glory of HaKadosh Baruch Hu taking us out of Egypt. What exactly did they do over there in that first Seder night? We'll link that video too. And as usual, also, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it, comment below on YouTube, spread this around, send it to your friends, send it to your family, tell the Dvar Torah over on your table on Shabbos. And of course, if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing and help us grow this channel. And Shkoyach Yitzi.
Shkoyach Tuvia, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, and in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll talk again next week.